Welcome to Dr. Dan's channel. Today we're looking at how the British Empire collapsed, not as a sudden event, but as a predictable economic and structural process, and why modern Britain is now facing a smaller, quieter, but eerily familiar version of that same cycle. This is not a story about nostalgia. It's a story about systems: debt, trade, productivity, demography, politics, and confidence. And to understand where Britain may be heading, we first need to understand something most people miss. Empires don't fall only because they're defeated. They fall because they become structurally unaffordable. The four-stage pattern. Behind imperial collapse history shows that dominant powers rarely collapse randomly. They tend to move through a repeating sequence. Call it a cycle, call it a pattern, call it structural gravity. And crucially, this pattern is not just about currency. Currency is a symptom. The deeper issue is the economic engine underneath. How a state funds itself, how it allocates capital, and whether the world still trusts its long-term stability. Here are the four stages. Stage 1. Ascension. In Stage 1, a rising power becomes the world's system. It builds an economic model that the rest of the world plugs into through trade, finance, law, shipping routes, and institutions. For Britain, this rise accelerated from the late 1600s onward and matured through the 18th and 19th centuries. Britain didn't just win wars. Britain rewired the global economy. London became a global clearinghouse. British insurers, shipping networks, courts, banks, and merchant houses created something powerful, a trusted system. And when the Industrial Revolution scaled that system, Britain didn't just sell goods. Britain exported capital and rules. By the 1800s, sterling had become central to world trade and finance. Britain's empire wasn't only territorial, it was a financial architecture: ports, cables, shipping, banking, and a global web of contracts. This is what dominance looks like, not just power, but indispensability. Stage 2. Overextension. Stage 2 begins when the system's success becomes a burden. The empire's commitments, military, political, administrative, start growing faster than the productive base that pays for them. Britain faced a classic imperial dilemma. To protect the system, you expand the system, but expansion raises the cost of protection. By the early 20th century, the bills were stacking up. Britain fought major wars, maintained a global navy, managed far-flung colonies, and carried increasing welfare and reconstruction obligations at home. Then came the two world wars. World War I battered Britain financially. World War II nearly finished the job. After WTU's, Britain's debt burden surged to extraordinary levels, often cited around 250% of GDP in the post-war period, reflecting the sheer cost of total war and reconstruction. Now, let's anchor this with a historical comparison, because this matters. Across history, reserve and imperial dominance tends to crack around certain debt pressure zones. Britain's dominance began to slip at around the 130% debt to GDP zone, an inflection level often used in historical comparisons of overstretched states. Spain entered repeated sovereign stress and defaults at very high levels, often described as above 200% in these broad historical comparisons. The Dutch Republic's fiscal military state strained under immense burdens, often framed around 250% in simplified historical pattern narratives. Now, to be clear, these are not mechanical laws of economics. They are historical pattern markers, signals that the system is now paying more to maintain itself than it can sustainably generate. And Britain after WTU was deep in the danger zone. At that point, the empire wasn't just expensive, it was increasingly unfundable without external support, especially from the United States. This is where a subtle shift begins. Britain's system starts depending on someone else's system. And once that happens, it's no longer hegemony, it's managed decline. Stage 3. The silent exodus. Stage 3 is the phase people misunderstand. Decline does not begin with a dramatic collapse. It begins with quiet exits. Capital reallocates, talent relocates, companies diversify abroad, elites hedge risk, investors demand higher returns for the same trust. After Wabayuadi, Britain still had prestige, still had empire, on paper, still had global influence, but underneath, the world was changing. The US dollar system was rising, American industry surged, American capital markets deepened, and the post-war global order increasingly ran through Washington-backed institutions and dollar liquidity. At home, Britain was managing rationing, rebuilding, and industrial restructuring, while trying to act like the old imperial center. And in that environment, the silent exodus dynamics accelerated. Investment opportunities increasingly looked better in the US, brain drain grew, the center of gravity shifted away from sterling and toward dollars. What's important here is confidence. Markets don't wait for collapse. They move when the trend becomes readable. And once capital starts leaving, the state's room to maneuver shrinks. Stage 4, loss of control. Stage 4 arrives when the state can no longer defend its position. And for Britain, the symbolic turning points are well known. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound by 14.3%, a major signal that defending sterling's value had become too costly. Then, in 1976, Britain went to the IMF, an event that carried enormous psychological weight, the former global financial center becoming, effectively, a program country seeking external stabilization and credibility support. The deeper story is this. The empire did not fall primarily because Britain lost a single battle. It dissolved because Britain lost the ability to fund the structure that made Britain Britain. When that happens, currency stress follows. Then political stress follows. Then institutional stress follows. That is how empires end, not with a bang, but with structural exhaustion. Now fast forward modern Britain. Modern Britain is not an empire, but it still carries imperial economic expectations without imperial capacity. That mismatch is the crossroads. And if you want to understand why the UK feels poorer, why services feel strained, why infrastructure looks tired, why politics feels stuck, it's because Britain has spent the last decade plus living inside a slow-motion squeeze. Weak productivity growth, high housing costs, low investment, rising demographic pressure, post-2008 austerity scars, Brexit-related trade friction and uncertainty, regional imbalance. Let's go through the major structural pressures, calmly, clearly, and with evidence. 1. The Great Stagnation, productivity, and wages. The UK's productivity problem is not a headline. It's a slow leak that drains living standards year after year. The Office for National Statistics tracks labor productivity, output per hour and output per worker. The post-2008 period is widely described as unusually weak by historical UK standards, feeding what economists label the productivity puzzle. When productivity growth stalls, real wages stall. And this is why many households feel like they've worked harder without getting ahead. Now, this isn't about blaming workers. It's about the system's incentives. When capital investment is weak, machines, software, skills, productivity lags. And the UK has struggled for years with both public investment constraints and private investment caution, especially during periods of political and trade uncertainty. 2. The housing hostage situation. Housing in the UK behaves less like a normal market and more like a scarcity machine. One widely tracked indicator is the house price-to-earnings ratio. The ONS has shown that affordability worsened substantially over the long run, with ratios much higher than in earlier decades, especially in London and the Southeast. When housing absorbs huge shares of income, workers can't move to high-productivity cities, young people can't save or invest, entrepreneurship drops, family formation gets delayed, the economy becomes more rentier, extracting value rather than building it. And this isn't just social, it's economic. High housing costs reduce mobility and trap labor away from opportunity. 3. Austerity and the doom loop. After 2010, the UK pursued a long period of fiscal tightening. The argument was, reduce deficits, restore confidence. The criticism, made by many economists and policy analysts, is that prolonged underinvestment in public capacity can weaken productivity, degrade infrastructure, and create downstream costs that exceed the short-term savings. Even if you believe some fiscal restraint was necessary, the lived reality has been stressed local councils, strained public services, infrastructure maintenance delays, a sense of national wear. And when the state runs down systems, health, transport, planning capacity, that feeds back into weaker economic performance. 4. The Brexit effect, trade friction and investment uncertainty. Brexit didn't invent Britain's structural issues, but it removed buffers and added friction. One of the most cited official assessments is from the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility. The OBR has repeatedly stated that Brexit is expected to reduce the UK's long-run productivity, potential output, relative to remaining in the EU, with estimates commonly framed around a 4% long-term hit. That number matters because 4% of a national economy is not rounding error. It's the difference between more fiscal room versus permanent constraint, more investment versus chronic patching, upward mobility versus stagnation politics. And beyond trade barriers, uncertainty itself is costly. Investors price political unpredictability. 5. Demographics and the pension squeeze. Britain, like most advanced economies, is aging. Aging isn't a moral failure. It's a demographic reality, but it creates a fiscal geometry problem. More retirees relative to workers, more health and care costs, slower labor force growth, higher dependency ratios. In that context, the UK's triple lock pension policy is a major political and fiscal pressure point. The OBR has analyzed the long-term implications of pension policy sustainability and the growing weight of age-related spending. And politically, aging democracies often drift toward a kind of present bias. Protect current benefits now. Push reform costs into the future. That can work for a while, until it doesn't. 6. London versus the rest, the one-engine economy. The UK's regional imbalance is extreme by developed country standards. London is a global city with high productivity, deep capital markets, and international demand. But large parts of the UK operate with weaker transport connectivity, lower investment, fewer high-productivity clusters, fewer scaling opportunities for firms. This creates a vulnerability. If one engine slows, the whole plane struggles, and it fuels political volatility, because inequality isn't only about income, it's about perceived future. 7. The psychological end of the contract. There is also something harder to quantify, but economically real. The social contract belief that each generation will do better than the last. When that belief weakens, because wages stagnate, housing becomes unreachable, services deteriorate, trust fractures, and fractured trust produces unstable politics. That instability then discourages investment, and the cycle tightens. Is modern Britain doomed? No. But Britain is at a crossroads because it still has significant strengths. World-class universities, globally respected legal institutions, a serious scientific base, a global financial footprint. The question is whether Britain converts these into a coherent strategy or just manages decline. What a real exit strategy looks like, not slogans, not nostalgia, not culture war economics. A credible path out requires 5 hard pillars. 1. Productivity as national security. Treat productivity like infrastructure, something the state must actively enable. That means stable industrial policy, faster planning for labs, housing, transport, energy, incentives for private investment in technology and skills. 2. Housing reform. With teeth, Britain cannot grow like a modern economy, while housing behaves like a bottleneck. That requires planning reform, building at scale near high-productivity cities, infrastructure expansion that makes new supply politically feasible. 3. Investment, not just spending. The UK's problem isn't only how much government spends, it's whether spending builds future capacity. Capital investment, transport, energy grids, digital infrastructure, research has long-run multipliers. 4. Trade realism. Whatever one's view of Brexit politically, economically, the UK must reduce friction with its largest markets where possible, because growth depends on access, scale, and predictable rules. 5. Demographic honesty. Aging requires reform. Pensions policy sustainability, labor force participation, health system productivity, and a fairer distribution of burdens across generations. Final reflection. The British Empire didn't collapse because Britain was weak. It collapsed because Britain became structurally unsustainable. Overextended commitments, debt pressure, and capital flight eroded control. Modern Britain faces a quieter version of the same test. Not whether it can dominate the world, but whether it can adapt to post-imperial reality without losing coherence. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but it rhymes loudly. And the people who understand the pattern early retain options. The people who don't. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe to Dr. Dan's channel for clear, in-depth breakdowns of the forces shaping our world. Like the video if it helped your thinking, and share it with someone who values depth over noise.